Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest presentation in the series celebrating Scapa Flow, organised by Another Orkney Production. I always think that name for an excellent company has a slightly resigned feel to it. I don't think we need to be resigned about what they produce, which is really excellent. Well, we have a splendid presentation today from Commander David Hobbs, MBRN, retired. It's called Hoxa, Orkney's Front Door. And thinking about what he's going to cover, it's all too easy when considering defence and warfare to confine your thoughts to what we might generally call kinetic energy, force on the move delivered by aircraft, warships and missiles, artillery, rifles and infantry. All of these deliver kinetically in active conduct or combat. But there's another major kind of defence resource nations can use, which is non-kinetic. We could call it static energy. There are plentiful examples of that static energy around our country, of course, from Anglo-Saxon hill forts to castle strongholds and Martello towers, right on to the so-called Palmerston's Follies, fortifications built all around the UK in the Victorian era to counter the threat of the French Navy. But static energy is no folly, and nowhere bears better witness of that than the Orkney Island defences at Hoxa, the entrance to Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy's northernmost and biggest base in both world wars. Well, here today to tell the story of that static kinetic energy, if you like, and if you like, also the very kinetic energy of thought and work that created it, is Commander Hobbs. A little bit about David Hobbs. He served in the Royal Navy as a Fleet Air Arm pilot flying fixed-wing and rotary aircraft. He was later curator and principal historian of the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Somerset before becoming a full-time author and lecturer in 2006. And he lectures and broadcasts on naval subjects worldwide and has written many books on naval aviation, including The Royal Navy's Air Service in the Great War, which includes the story of Squadron Commander Dunning, and The Dawn of Carrier Strike and the World of Lieutenant Lucy DSO RN, that's another title, and the attack on Königsberg. But his latest book is a comprehensive study of Royal Navy aviation from 1908 to the present day, aircraft of the Royal Navy. But for his presentation to us tonight, however, he returns to terra firma with Hoxa, Orkney's Front Door. David.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob, for that super introduction. Okay, on to the next slide, please. Right, there's a chart prepared to show the Scapa Flow defences as they were into 1941. In other words, after the U-47 got in to attack Royal Oak in Scapa Flow. By then, Churchill had given the instruction that barriers were to be built between the mainland, Bury and South Ronaldsay, that would completely block the eastern entrances into Scapa Flow. But the Royal Navy for years had used other, less comprehensive, less final means of blocking its anchorages, and that was to use boom defence. The more I go into boom defence, the more fascinating a subject it is. And if you look at this chart, you will see that there are a number of different types of semi-movable blocks coming into Hoxa. If we could have the red light, you can see there are block ships at Lambholm before the barriers were built. Beneath that, you can see what looks like a chain link fence running north-south between mainland and Bury. That's an anti-boat defence. What's that? In other words, it's a line of floats held together by wires so that any small ship trying to come in would bump into it and be stopped. It wouldn't sink it, but by stopping it, it would mean that it would be still for long enough for the shore batteries to engage it and probably destroy it with quick-fire weapons. You can see thicker lines in Hoxa, and you can see a number of broken lines in between them. And south, coming from west from South Ronaldsay towards Flutter, you can see some dotted lines that are indicator loops. So looking at all these, there are three basic ways of blocking a harbour. One is to use a line of floats with a chain between them to stop surface ships coming in. The next is an anti-submarine net. Now, I haven't got a picture to show you this, but if you imagine squares of wire linked together, a bit like a cargo net that's lowered from floats at the surface to the seabed, the aim is to stop a dived submarine coming in. It would bump into the wire and become enmeshed with it. The last and finest mesh, if you like, are a series of interlocking circles of galvanized wire rope that were anti-torpedo nets designed to stop somebody or stop a torpedo fired from a submerged U-boat from hitting an anchored vessel. So you can see not only are some of these in the Hoxa booms, but some of them were positioned across the middle of the flow to the east of Cava, to the northeast of Farah, if you could show those with the... And then by Stromness, the whole thing was replicated again towards the flow from Grimsay. So not only were there barriers to stop or detect ships coming in, trying to come into the flow and U-boats, but there were other nets designed to break Scapa flow up into areas so that even if a U-boat got into the flow, it wouldn't be able to torpedo ships in the main anchorages to the east of Cava or the northeast of Farah. Last and by no means least, because they'd been effective in the First World War, were controlled minefields, the short lines you can see north of Hoxa. Controlled loops were laid on the seabed. Could we go back to the chart, please? On the seabed that would detect any metal object moving over them. And if they were detected, the minefields could be detonated to blow them up. Similar system used at the end of the First World War actually blew up a U-boat in 1918 that was trying to get into the flow in the last days of the war. So boom defense was an enormous organization. If we could go on to the next slide, please. And this is the part of the Hoxa boom that you can see showing the floats from which the nets are suspended that would prevent a U-boat trying to get in. You can see there are two gates or spaces. There's one, there's another. And there would be gate boats that would open smaller nets that would come across to close them when no shipping was coming through. So you can see parts of the system. Some of the nets were pretty obvious to everyone there. The buoys that you can see either side of the nets were there to add strength to the whole structure so that in a storm the nets might not be dragged out of position. You can imagine that ordering the use of these nets was quite a big and complicated business. The King's Harbour Master would have to be aware when every ship was due to come into the flow or leave the flow. He would have to give comprehensive instructions to the boats that would open the gates at the right time. If it was dark, he would have to arrange for navigation lights, such as the one you can see on the right, to be lit so that ships would know accurately where they were. The gun defences would have to be notified so that they would know that darkened ships would be coming in and they were expected, either in or out. And the whole thing would have to be done without using radio transmissions, in other words, by visual signal or by written message passed around the flow by a picket boat, because if the enemy were able to detect a sudden increase in radio transmissions, he would know that there was a movement in the near future or taking place. So the business was quite complicated and had to work to perfection. Any mistake could be a disaster if the nets weren't open or if the gun batteries opened fire on a friendly ship. The Admiralty had an organisation that continued between the wars, but like everything else, it was run down. The boom defence organisation was run down. And when rearmament began in the late 1930s, the Admiralty took kinetic defence, as Rob had mentioned it, very seriously, and was quick to order new ships and weapon systems, it was much slower to order defensive systems for the fleet's bases. The net result is, after the First World War, Scapa Flow's defences had been almost completely run down. It was only decided in 1938 that Scapa was going to be used as the main base for the home fleet and not the Firth of Forth or Cromarty. And so the need to put in place defences like this wasn't taken until late 38, early 39. And in fact, the Admiralty only reformed its harbour defence organisation in early 1939. It moved as quickly as it could, but it lacked both the money and the people to make sure that things were there in time. The net result was Youth 47 getting through. Next slide, please. I've put these in to give some idea what accommodation was like. These actually date from the First World War, but they show that the people ashore who manned the indicator loops, the minefields, and took charge of the vessels that ran the nets and the barriers weren't exactly luxurious. This is a camp in the First World War behind the Hoxa battery, but those in the Second World War were pretty similar. Nissen hut with a coal or wood burning stove in one end of it, pretty exposed to the elements. And the smaller huts, which contained the detection equipment, weren't much better. Next, please. That's another angle looking out across the Hoxa Strait. Most of them were pretty temporary structures as well, so they would have been fairly cold. Food wouldn't have been great, but at least they were cheerful. Next, please. You may recognise this. It's St Margaret Hope, where the Gills Bay ferry comes in now. Shows the early structures of the boom defence depot there. The wall on the left side is the edge of where the ferry comes in, the Pentalina. But the principal interest in this photograph, in the foreground, you can see some floats made out of stout wood with iron brackets holding them together, and on top of them is a chain. So this is part of a boom used to prevent surface ships coming into the flow. Similar booms would have been manufactured and used all over the world. And to give you an idea, they were effective. When they pulled one of the first booms across the entrance in 1939, the embryonic King's Harbour Master organisation in Scapa Flow omitted to mention that it had been put in place when an R-class battleship was coming in, and the boom stopped it in the water. So that's a 23,000-ton battleship, probably moving at about 15 knots, and it was stopped in the water by this boom, and it didn't break it. So it was a good piece of kit, and it worked, and it fulfilled its purpose. It would have stopped anything up to and including a battleship for long enough for the guns to engage it with ease. Next slide, please. This is another view across the depot, which remained until the post-war era. So some of the brick buildings you see there now were built later in the war or in the early post-war era. You can see the jetty poking out from it, and you can also see some of the myriad coasters that serviced the boom defence organisation. They were the ones that carried and put in place buoys, anchors and chain cable on the seabed to moor these things. They would have carried ammunition, stores, mail, and all sorts of things to support the fleet, to support the boom defence organisation, to support the people who operated the balloon barrage around the flow. And they would have carried coal to the various establishments, no doubt ammunition to some of the gun batteries, including anti-aircraft batteries. So although they're unsung and not much is remembered about them now, these little coasters were the backbone of the boom defence. Passive defence was one way of describing it, organisation, in that it was stationary and in one place. Next, please. The Admiralty requisitioned literally hundreds of fishing vessels, both trawlers and drifters, on the outbreak of war. They undertook a number of tasks. They had small coal boilers firing reciprocating steam engines. They could travel around about 10 knots. They could carry passengers, stores, and they could be used as gate boats on the nets with a winch on the stern attached to a cable, and they would have been used to tug the gates open to allow ships through. In this instance, I believe, according to the caption of this photograph, it's at Stanger Head, and it's being used to deliver coal for use by the accommodation at the shore battery there. You can see the sheer legs at the top of the cliff, triangular structure there, and bags of coal, possibly other things, stores, bread, etc., are being hauled up. And you can see it's quite a labour-intensive task, the number of people it took to do it. It's also not easy in that the skipper's got to bring his vessel in on a rocky shore and then chug it back to Line S, where most of them were parked up when they weren't being used. So literally there were perhaps even 1,000 of these things at naval bases up and down the country and around the world, all fulfilling a vital but unsung task. Also of interest, according to the Naval Discipline Act in place during the war, 1940-41, every shore establishment, such as the naval air stations at Hatston and Twat and the base at Line S, was commissioned as a ship and had a ship name. HMS Sparrowhawk was Hatston, HMS Tern was Twat. But the letter of the law in the Naval Discipline Act said that you couldn't commission a shore establishment. There had to be a ship as the nominal depot ship to which everything was appointed, drafted, or whatever. And so you'll find most naval air stations in the thing, it said nominal depot ship is a drifter, just such as this. So although it's fulfilling a task, etc., you could well find, if you researched into it, that this fishing vessel was the nominal depot ship for a naval shore establishment in Orkney. Fascinating. In 1957, the Naval Discipline Act was reviewed, and they managed to take out the legal requirement for a ship, thus saving the Admiralty the requirement to own several hundred ships to be nominal depot ships. So one of the quirks of the Naval Discipline Act that's largely forgotten now. Next, please. But this says what it says on the label, HMS Pomona, Boom Defence Depot. And the people you see here are civilian employees who worked in it, probably amongst their other tasks, using steel wire rope, galvanized, in order to make anti-submarine and anti-torpedo nets. Pomona was started as an outstation from the Line S main base, and it was just south of it at a place called Crockness, or just south and a little east of it. But in 1943, it became so big that it was commissioned as a ship in its own right, and it continued as HMS Pomona until 1945, the end of 45, when it was subsumed back into the Line S depot and gradually run down. And vestiges of it would have remained until 1957, when the last of the base at Scapa Flow was formally closed. You can see they're quite an interesting looking bunch. They're wearing a variety of clothes, ranging from old sports jackets. The chap with the tie, if you could point him out just to the left of the Pomona badge. Go left a bit more there. is probably a manager because he's wearing a collar and tie and he's got an Admiralty issue duffel coat. Most of the rest you can see are in boiler suits with sea boots, and they would have been employed, let's say, on net defences and other manual tasks in the depot. Gives a very good impression, and I wonder how many people watching this would know the people who were there. This is probably taken in about 1945, towards the end of the war. You find when conflicts end, there's a big rush for every ship or organization to have its photograph taken for posterity. So I don't know exactly when this was taken, but I would guess in 1945. And it captures the atmosphere very well. On to the next one, please. You probably recognize this. It's the waterfront at Lyonesse. And if you look in the background, you can see one of the furnace fuel oil tanks, one of which still exists as part of the National Museum of the Royal Navy there now. Two cranes on their railway line. They're both steam powered. You can see they have a little chimney on the top. Underneath that would have been a little coal boiler. So it would have had a stock of coal on to one side of the cab, kept fired up. The steam would have provided the power for pistons, which would have raised and lowered the jib arm. You can see they run on rails, so they could move around the waterfront. And in the background, there's a stack of floats for anti-submarine and anti-torpedo nets. And then under them, those are spherical. Underneath them, you can see round iron weights. Those are sinkers for the weights. Obviously, there are some quite strong tides in Scapa. If you just suspended nets from the floats like a curtain, they would tend to swing out with the tide as it came in and went out, and that may leave a gap at the bottom. So it's pretty important that at the bottom of the net, you had a line of sinkers to hold the bottom fairly well down. So some of those cranes did still exist the last time I went to Lyonesse, although they were pretty rusty and tatty by now. I don't know if they're still there. Okay, next, please. This again is Lyonesse. You can see the cranes on the shore. To the right of the cranes, you can see there's a pile of mooring buoys, chain floats, and the other detritus of a boom defence depot. But most important, you can see the ramp coming down to the waterline. That's still there. So next time you catch a ferry over to Lyonesse, you can see that running from some of the ruined buildings and the southern end of the Lyonesse depot that was, where the boom defence equipment was maintained and made. You can see these floats are linked together by wire cable, which is run in and secured at the back end of the vessel here, which I think is a boom defence vessel, probably a bar class one. But you can see there isn't a net. You can see the floats as they come down the chute are connected by a line of wires, but there's nothing dangling underneath them. So these are probably being employed as an anti-boat net to stop surface vessels getting into the flow. Although it could be, of course, that once the floats were put in position, a net could be brought out and attached to them, but that would be a bit more complicated than doing it on shore. Next slide, please. Right, this is the back end of a net layer. The Navy had two specialist net layers commissioned as warships built in the 1930s, Guardian and Protector. Guardian was the first, Protector was the second. Some of you may know it. It was later converted into an ice patrol ship and used to defend the British Antarctic territories and the Falkland Islands for a number of years in the 1950s and 60s, had a helicopter platform built on the back end. You can see it's here, it's anchored, or it's just running out of line S. You can see the depot and its cranes in the top right. And you can see a lot of the ships that are delivering ammunition or supplies moored behind it. So Guardian and Protector were fascinating ships. In theory, they could go anywhere in the world, and they were widely travelled, in order to lay net defences in naval bases. And they did so in places such as Gibraltar, Malta, Simonstown in South Africa, all the bases around the UK, Scapa Flow, Devonport, Portsmouth, Chatham, Alexandria, Port Said, Trincomalee, Singapore before the Japanese captured it. So they were invaluable ships. In peacetime, or when not laying nets, they could also be used to tow battle back practice targets for warships to shoot at. Guardian eventually had a deck built over the net deck, which you see here, on which there was a cabin which was used as a photographic cabin to print photographs of shoots to see how accurate the ship's gunfire had been. But thankfully, this photograph was taken before that was done. So let's look at what we see here. You see the White Ensign. It's commissioned as a Royal Navy warship. So it's either Guardian or Protector. I can't tell which. You look at it, you can see a senior rating looking down towards what's going on, and ratings who are trying to sort out the knitting mess of wire in the center. You can see if the net began to slip over the stern, as it's designed to do, this could be an absolute death trap if you were caught in it. So once the wire was released, it was pretty important that everyone got clear of the wooden boarding to one side to watch it go. What have we got here? Down the left, you can see neatly stacked all the floats attached to the wire. Down the right are all the cast iron sinkers, again attached to the wire. And in the center, you can see the net itself. Now, they're not small links. So in other words, this isn't an anti-torpedo net. It's an anti-submarine net. So there'd be big rectangles, and they could be quite sizable, because as long as they were smaller than the frontal area of a submarine, they would catch it and prevent it going through. Preferably, in a perfect situation, if those squares were big enough for the submarine to shove its bow through, that would be even better, because its hydroplanes might become caught in the wire and it might not be able to pull out. So the idea was very much that the squares were large enough for a U-boat to get trapped in the net, not just to be for its progress through it to be stopped, because as it maneuvered fore and back to try and break free from the wire, having been meshed in it, the floats would bob up and down and show that it was there. That then could lead to it being sought for by the magnetic indicator loops on the seabed, and if in range, a controlled minefield detonated under it, for quick firing guns in the shore batteries to fire at the surface, because it couldn't be very far below it and it would want to stick its periscope up to see what was going on. Or better still, for some of the minor war vessels to come out with depth charges and drop them at the point where the net was bobbing. So although it's just described as a net, this is actually quite a well-made, complicated structure. And as I say, they'd been around since the First World War, in some instances even before, from the original design of the torpedo. People had tried to stop them hitting ships by using nets. And they were still in use. I can remember as a midshipman being taken into the tunnels that were bored into Gibraltar during the First and Second World Wars. And there were big cavernous stowage areas in those tunnels, some of which were full of the anti-submarine and anti-torpedo nets that could be brought out and used by the Navy's boom defense organization in, again, if there were another war. And I can remember as a cadet in the early 1960s being taken to the still existing Royal Navy boom defense depot at Altby next to Loch Ewe, where they still made nets like these. they had a cavernous great shed like an aircraft hangar, in which there were a number of men who looked exactly like the ones we saw just now at Pomona, using wire and splicing that wire together to make nets like this one. So they may even still have a place in today's warfare to stop drone submarines getting into a naval base. So although this photograph dates from the Second World War, it's by no means old technology, and something as simple as this net could have quite a role to play. On to the next slide, please. This is a couple of links from an anti-torpedo net. You can see from the 1 foot ruler on the side that they're much smaller than the big squares you could see on the previous net. And the reason for that is you wouldn't want a torpedo, most of which would be 21 inches or just under 2 feet across, to go through it. You would want the net to stop it. A lot of torpedoes are detonated magnetically. At the time, they might also have had a contact pistol on the warhead at the front of the torpedo, which would have had whiskers coming out sideways from it. Deflecting the whisker would cause an electrical impulse to go into the exploder that would detonate the head. So each one of these rings would be small enough to detonate the torpedo, and to do so well away from any likely target. So the anti-submarine nets would have been made of lots and lots and lots of hand-spliced flexible steel wire rope twisted here. You can see they're very well made. It's quite difficult to see where the splice is, but if you look to the extreme right there, you can just make out where the ends of the wire have been spliced together to make the loop. They're quite heavy, and thank you, Moira MacDonald, for letting me use this image, but they're sufficiently heavy that she uses them to keep her bin lids down when there's a wind blowing. So it gives you an idea what the weight of the whole net must have been. Onward, please. And this is a picture of Wren's making just such an anti-submarine torpedo net in the Boom Defence Depot shed in Lyonesse. Looking at the floor, you can see there are bits of wire there. Now, I don't know if those are about to be twisted to make a ring or whether they're just gash bits of rope of wire that have been cut off from some larger structure and being used. But you can see they're using some pretty big pieces of kit to twist the wires into shape, to splice them. They're wearing pretty big, cumbersome gloves because you'd cut your hands to ribbons if you tried to do this by hand. But you can see how they would make these, a bit like knitting, row by row. You'd make each individual link, put it in, and then hook it up onto the top there. And when it was all done, you would use a forklift truck to pick up one end of it, drag it, and then you would go through the process of attaching floats and weights. Usually, a net as big and heavy as this would be made in small chunks, think curtains, and they would be towed out chunk at a time and then wire spliced together once they were in situ. A single net to cover half the distance across the Hoxa boom would be far too heavy to deal with in one go. So quite a structure when you think about it. Which leads one on to another point. How many of these things have left something at Orkney that you can see today? And the answer is a surprising number. If you drive across the barrier from mainland to Burray, look down at the beach as you come off the barrier to your left, in other words, the eastern side of the north shore of Burray, and you'll see that there are 3 old rotten wood and iron floats, like the ones I showed you in the photograph at St Margaret's Hope, used for a boom to stop surface ships coming in. So some still exist, and there are still some lying on that beach at Burray where they were discarded when the war ended. If you go to the beach at Yesnaby on the north of mainland, near where the Navy had a gunnery range, you can see that some of these wartime anti-torpedo nets have been dragged up onto the beach, where they help to form a sand dune that protects the beach against longshore drift or storms. And I think I'm right in saying it's outside Orkney, but if you go to Edinburgh Waverley Station, if you're on the southbound, the platform for the southbound LNER Express to King's Cross, look up at the bank that slopes up from the left, and you'll see that they've put wire mesh up there to stop the earth sliding if it rains. And it looks very like one of these anti-torpedo nets. So I don't know if it's something that's been made in their like, or whether it's an actual wartime anti-torpedo net that's been used. But these were substantial structures, several of which survived. Because I told you that putting them out would have been difficult and they would have been done in small sections, when the war ended, it was deemed to be far too difficult and complicated to drag a lot of them in, and some of them were sunk in the flow. So I believe that if you go to some of the places indicated on the chart, and I'll show you again when we finish, instead of dragging them away, they just fired rifles at the floats. And so they sank down to the bottom, and substantial chunks of the net defences might still be there lying at the bottom of the flow. So yes, please, to the next slide. And these are the maids of all work, the boom defence vessels. These are members of the bar class. In other words, every one of them had a name beginning with bar, Barbican, Barnet, bar something or other. So there are two of them here, photograph taken from one. You can see the line of floats, perhaps the same one that we saw being dragged into the water from line S and being put into position by the other bar boat. You can see at the stern of the further one, there's a very rounded transom that's covered in wood, so it can withstand a lot of metal objects smashing into it as they're towed, dragged, hauled in, winched out, or what have you. At the bow, there are two what are called horns that would have a lift of several tons. They could be used for hauling up the end of a net. And in this case, I think you can see that the net's being lowered from it. It could also lift mooring buoys, anchors, cables, and anything of that sort up to quite a few tons. And other things could be lifted on the derrick attached on the foremast. So you'd have a strong area on the forward bit where you could carry a buoy or a navigational mark out to lower it into position. I couldn't find out exactly how many ships like this were used by the Royal Navy around the world in the Second World War, but the answer is hundreds. They served from Scapa Flow to Australia and New Zealand. And I did find that in 1954, the Royal Navy still had 90 of them in commission. Most of them were bar boats like these. Some of them were net boats where they had names beginning in net, netball, net something or other. And some of them had names, they were named after types of duck. I think they were the biggest ones. But to give you an idea, when I first joined the Far East Fleet in the 1960s, the late 1960s, as you go into the Johor Strait towards Singapore Naval Base, you passed Loy Yang Boom Defence Base, at which there were 4 of these moored, with some big sheds on the shore. So they still had anti-submarine, anti-ship, and anti-torpedo nets ready at Loy Yang to put across the Johor Straits. So the use of these things went on for years after the war. Next, please. Not Scapa Flow. This is Sydney, New South Wales. That shows you how the boom operated. This is part of the British Pacific Fleet returning to Sydney after the Japanese surrender. It's taken on the 24th of August 1945. You can see Implacable, Formidable, and the destroyers Grenville, Urchin and Undine coming back. You can see the boom across. Some of it's steel posts embedded into the seabed, but some of it's net and buoys. You can see here the gate vessel moored to a buoy, and you can see here that the gate has been tethered open. It shrunk a bit, but it would stretch as you brought it across to the other fixed point. So that's how the boom would open. I talked briefly about the complication of ordering it to be opened, etc. By the time this was taken, they were probably happy to leave it open, although there were still fears that rogue Japanese U-boat commanders might try and get in. It wasn't deemed very likely by the 24th. That gives you an idea how the boom operated. Next, please. These are two bar-class boats, Barranca and Barcastle. The ship's name and badge committee must have had quite an exciting time by the time they got up to the 100th one, thinking of names that began with bar. But you can see here, even here, there's a small boat alongside that would carry libertymen, mail, spares, bread, messages from the King's Harbour Master, and anything else to support them. Next slide, please. And this is the boom being worked. You can see a couple of boom defence vessels out there, the line of floats. Inshore, you could use some fairly solid concrete structures bedded on the seabed. Some of those can still be seen. I mean, even in places like Plymouth, where I was born, going out to Drake's Island, you can still see the line of anti-surface ship and U-boat defences. Mooring buoys that provided strength at either end of the net to stop it being dragged by the tide as it came in and out. And I think with that, I've just about had my allotted time. So what I'm going to do is put the chart up again, there it is, so that you can see all the different types of defence where they were. I hope that stimulated some interest. It certainly got my interest, and I'm keen to find out more about boom defence. So if anyone comes across the Admiralty Manual of Boom Defence Techniques anywhere, I'd be very interested in getting hold of a copy. I'm going to look out for one. I don't know if any listeners have got questions, but I'll have a go at answering them if you have. Thank you very much. Questions, please.
Well, David, thank you. That's an excellent talk. I mean, what strikes one particularly is the enormous amount of effort that goes into just this part of the war effort. This
Yes.
extraordinary national effort. And it's something you kind of don't perhaps think about, but there's a vast amount of, man and woman power and material and so on.
And the amount of steel that must have gone into it, and that's
Yes,
high grade
exactly.
steel. You wouldn't want it to go rusty quickly, and it's all galvanized.
Indeed, yeah, that's right. So
Thousands of tons of steel would have gone into making that.
exactly, yeah, it's extraordinary effort. And then, as you say, replicated elsewhere, like, for example, Singapore and so on. Well, has anybody got any questions? I've got loads, so I'm going to be greedy. If somebody doesn't speak up now, I'm going to be greedy and jump in. Right. Overall, lots of questions. How big was the RN Boom Defence Organisation, Dave, in terms of numbers, ships and so on? Can you put a number on it? That's a bit difficult, I should think.
No, I mean, you're looking at thousands of the smaller vessels which had some part to play. You're looking at probably, certainly high hundreds, thousands of people, even in Scapa Flow. If you think about Wee Fee, which was the headquarters of the whole thing, when you take into account communications, which were 24/7 in watches, the command and control of deciding how things were going to be done, the interface with the Air Defence of Great Britain organisation, the interface with the anti-aircraft gunnery systems, the interface with the coast defence gun batteries, and the interface with the Admiralty, which was ordering fleet movements, etc. So when you see a statement on the 20th of May or whatever it was, Hood sailed with her escorting destroyers to intercept the Bismarck.
Yes.
Just think what that meant. It wasn't quite dark, it was dusk, late evening, but the navigation buoys probably needed to be lit but only for long enough to get her out into the Pentland Firth with her escorts. Needed to be done, as I said, without radar. The gates needed to be open in all the nets for the minimum amount of time possible. If it was somebody coming the other way, you needed to make sure if you opened the gate and one magnetic signature came in, you wanted to make pretty sure that another one didn't follow it, the U-boat following a ship through, the way some of our X-craft did to get in to attack the Tirpitz.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
So you need a lot of people to be on their game, alert, and to be told what's happening. I only know of one recorded instance where somebody failed to get the message that the fleet was about to go to sea, and that was the aircraft seaplane carrier Campania on the night before Jutland, who was anchored just off Scapa Bay, recovering her aircraft, which had carried out a flying exercise, and she missed the visual signal to sail. And it never occurred to anyone to say, "Why aren't you here?" until it was too late. But thousands of ships and thousands of people,
What's
most
extraordinary?
of whom
Yeah.
were recalled to service,
Mm.
a lot of them. So they would have been retired naval officers brought back to service to run the King's Harbour Master organisation,
Yes.
um, and retired from service senior ratings and conscript hostilities only junior ratings who learnt the job on the job.
It's also, as you made clear, there's a tremendous communication system going. You look at the physical
Mm,
um, uh, commitment, if you like, to all of this in terms of
mm,
the boys and the nets and all the rest of it, but also the communications one. You've talked about what happened to them after 1945. I can still remember looking at Jane's fighting ships and seeing pictures of these boom defense vessels.
mm.
You mentioned briefly, but if you can expand it, maybe you can. They were obviously useful for other things too, which is why they were retained in service long after the booms themselves were not needed after 1945. So they had a useful function beyond the boom work, by the sound of it,
Yes, the
as you
most
said.
obvious one was salvage.
Mm.
The Admiralty ran its own salvage organisation up until the 1960s. So you might remember the submarine Affray that sank in
Yeah,
1949.
yeah.
The
Awful.
organisation that sought to recover it or rescue the crew
Mm.
was
Yes.
an Admiralty-owned naval manned organisation. That was one. And the other was mooring in the naval dockyards. There are a lot of things that you need to make sure that work properly that differ in a naval dockyard from a commercial shipyard or whatever. And at the time, the Admiralty would have run all of those. Now it's done commercially, and the Navy relies on civilian organizations under contract to fulfill those roles. But up until the 1960s into gusting the 70s, it was all a naval task.
Yes, well, someone like Serco probably does this for them now because they do an awful lot of that sort of tender and support work, don't they?
Mm.
Looking at it, I know there's I'm trying to remember which one it was, but there's a Hornblower where he has to break a boom somewhere, and he actually
Yes,
leaps upon this log, which is the support for this
yes.
shoes
It's
and
one
slipping
of
off.
the oldest defense techniques known to man. It's been used since the age of sail.
Yes,
Yes, and logs chained together were one
yes,
way of doing
right,
it.
yes.
Yeah.
And he observes it and manages to get it cut. As usual with Forrest, who's so good at this, it's all very touch and go. He nearly
The
steps off. All the rest.
attack on Fat Shan Creek that ended in Britain seizing Hong Kong in the
Mm.
Second
Yeah,
Opium War or whatever it was.
yeah,
Fat Shan Creek had a boom
yeah.
which the sailors broke to get through. So yes, it is one of
It
the.
is a long established technique, and it's so interesting that it's decided so late, 38, to
Mm,
revitalize it, and yet not in time, sadly, to save Royal Oak, but in time, good order, really, to get all
mm.
of that system up and running relatively quickly after that. Do you think if Royal Oak hadn't happened, that it would still have happened? I suspect it would have done, but
It would have done, but at its own pace. I think
hmm,
Churchill was rather galvanized, hence the barriers to saying, I want it done now, not next week. But I think part of the problem, the subsequent Board of Inquiry rather blamed the Flag Officer Orkney and Shetland for not doing it quickly enough. I think partially it was remoteness. It wasn't
Mm,
something the board could see, so they
yes,
didn't quite realise the enormous import of having a base that wasn't adequately defended.
yeah,
Even though, as recently as 1914, it hadn't been adequately defended,
yeah.
exactly the same thing happened, that ships had to go and be based on the west coast of Scotland
Yes, that's right. They're
until Scapa Flow was made ready.
secure. Extraordinary thing. And of course, as you say, very late on, one U-boat was actually caught by the
Mm.
passive defences, we might call it. Was anybody else, were any others caught by this, in one form or another, being caught on the wire or being blocked from
Around the
getting in?
world, yes. I'm just trying to think. I can't think of a specifics, but yes. I mean, it was a system that worked.
It's effective, yeah.
The Navy also had hydrophones, but they weren't nearly as effective in Orkney as they were in other places because the strength of the current
Mm,
caused a lot of bottom noise.
yes,
So there would always be noise in the background.
yes. Very difficult to differentiate it
Mm.
between them. And of course, we come right up to date, the sort of system stretching very secretly, supposedly, so stretching from Iceland or near as Iceland across to Greenland
Mm.
to capture Russian submarines going in. That is a kind of boom, but it's an acoustic one, obviously. But
Yes.
it is a very, very well established technique. Is anybody, I'm hogging the conversation, I'm loving it, but I am hogging it. Does anybody else want to pop in? Or the people being modest and shy and retiring? People often are. But there's one other thing I would like to talk about as detail. Splicing. That was very interesting to see that splice because it's virtually invisible. Is
Mm.
that simply, is it twisting on? So is that firm enough or is it a bit more
Yes.
than that?
You twist the bits of wire in together.
Hmm.
Um, that would be an end splice, but
Yeah.
with a rope, you stop a rope fraying by bringing the ends back on themselves and tucking the ends
Yes.
in. Well, that's effectively you open up the two bits of wire and introduce the bits through them, and then I think they spot weld it as well, but
Oh, yes. I
you
was thinking,
wouldn't
is that strong
see.
enough to contain it? Because it's
It
got a,
probably wouldn't be as strong as you wanted, but
yeah.
it would introduce a smooth finish.
Yes, and you've got to really, it's got to deal with some very rough, the sea will destroy it if it can. Um,
One of
always.
the in As a sub-lieutenant, I was the forecastle officer of the aircraft carrier Hermes just before I went off flying training.
Yes.
And my petty officer of the forecastle, was a boom defense technician.
Mm.
And he was about 5 feet high and about, no, say just over 5 feet high and just over 5 feet wide, the hairiest man I think I've ever seen. And he was superb at doing things with anchor cable, wire, and anything else you could name, with enormous pieces of ironmongery for breaking the links to put
Yeah.
the anchor off and so forth. And I never ceased to be amazed how good he was at
Mm.
dealing with wire, chain, and anything else you can name. Sheer raw seamanship,
Yeah.
uh, rope as well.
Yeah.
Um, Quite impressive.
This is very impressive what the Navy can do. And I have here, I don't know whether we can show it or not, but oh no, yes, it is. I used to know an ex-hood. Sadly, I died before I get to interview him, but he did most wonderful mopboards. What I can't show you because I've got it fixed carefully is a light bulb
Mhm.
with Seaman in full ceremonial rig, that's to say white gaiters, etc. And behind him in the light bulb shape, there's a beautiful red velvet shape, if you like, and on which are tiny little bends and
Oh,
hitches.
right. Yeah.
Absolutely beautiful work. But of course, he did much bigger stuff too.
Yes.
It's really extraordinary to see that.
Skilled.
So, how?
I forget what I was watching the other day. There was something where somebody came out with naval expressions. Um, and one of the ones they came out was the anchors clumped a cat bill. And they said, what on earth does that mean? And it's where you disconnect, you lower the anchor a bit, hoist it, and you attach it to an iron ring, if you like, on the side of the ship. So you can disconnect the anchor chain
Hmm.
and run it out to attach that to a mooring buoy.
Oh, right.
And the thing you attach it to is a cat bill and you clump it by attaching it. But it's a lost language.
Yeah. It is, yeah. So little that
Something the gnarled seaman in
so
his
heavily
bar
automated
boat
nowadays. Yeah.
would have.
Yes, it
They were
is.
the
Yeah.
last coal-burning vessels in commission in the
Yeah.
Royal Navy, the bar boats.
Surely I'm about to do some filming with Tug Challenge, which was at Dunkirk, and
Mm,
is returning if they can get her ready in time for the anniversary. So she's pure coal, steam
mm,
coal fired, and she's in company with another tug called Portway. I've also filmed, which is also
mm.
steam powered. So they are still there.
If anyone gets the chance to see the film Above Us the Waves,
Yes.
it starts with the human chariot torpedoes and
Yes.
ends with the X-craft attacking the turrets. Okay,
Yes.
it was dramatized for the movie,
Yeah.
but the basic story is there where the X-craft would nose into a German
Yes.
anti-submarine net, which was
Yes.
probably pretty similar to a British one. It was sufficiently similar that they used British anti-submarine nets to practice on in the west coast of Scotland. And a diver would get into what was called a wet chamber, which effectively the little loo in the
Yeah.
submarine, lock the door, flood up, open a hatch, climb out with a big pair of bolt croppers,
Yes.
and he would slide forward along the top of the
Yes.
X-craft and bolt crop through the wire net,
Yes.
so that it would then rise a little bit and try and slither through the bit you'd cut.
Yeah.
But if you get a chance to see that, it gives you a pretty good idea of what the net was designed to do, stop it,
Yes.
and the defense. If you look at an early war British submarine, you'll see that it has what were called jump wires. So boat, conning tower, and the periscopes were on a pretty strong looking bracket on top, if
Yes.
you can visualize it. Well, attached to the front of that would be a steel wire cable shackled at either end. And at the front part, you'll see a triangular steel structure with a serrated edge like
Yes,
a
that's
saw.
right. Yes. Yes.
And that was a net cutter. And the idea is if you tried to penetrate an enemy defended anchorage, you would nose up to the wire and then go backwards and forwards and try and cut through the.
So you sort of saw it really, use
Yeah.
it to saw its way.
Um,
Yeah.
didn't really work very well, and you ran the huge risk that you would catch your foreplanes and get caught.
Yeah. And then you really are snookered.
And
Yes.
then you're saying, hello, I'm here, as
Yeah.
all the floats thing,
Yes.
and you would be attacked. But it shows that the net was a threat to a
Mm.
submarine.
It
It would limit your options if you were trying to attack a harbour.
Yeah.
And it's because it's a passive defence, you wouldn't necessarily know where it was.
Mm. Yeah.
One of the reasons the Germans carried out extensive air reconnaissance of Orkney was to try and work out where all the defences were.
And where the gaps might be. It's interesting. It actually features the X-craft feature in Dayton's very early novel Horse Underwater, which I think is excellent.
Hmm.
And one of the characters who turns out to be he's pretending to be Portuguese. In fact, he's British, and he'd been effectively he'd turncoat. And the reason was because he said, "You don't know what it's like to come out of that X-craft. He'd been in X-craft, and you come out, and the X-craft is banging against the wire. This is on the Tirpitz attack."
Hmm.
And he said, "I had this terror that I would fall off the X-craft and I would fall forever into the sea." And it just broke him, really. It's a very evocative description.
Yes, yes, I don't know how they did it. Some of the
No, it's really it took some
divers.
nerve. Really did. Of course, he did, of course, what was HMS Dolphin. There's a very, very funny description of doing the deep training. And
Hmm.
this sort of CPO chief instructor is keeping an eye on everybody, including people taking a swift nip from a rung. And he said, "I wouldn't do that anymore if I were you, sir. Doesn't do you any good in the diving." And he said that CPO Edwards, he had eyes in his buttons, that man. It's a very good description of. He did actually do the course,
Yeah.
it was research. And the interesting you said, the trouble with doing research that deep is that you're tempted to use so much of it, but he manages to weave it into the narrative in his usual sort of sardonic way. Those early books were worth rereading. Well, I don't know where we are. Where are we, everybody? I mean, I think, does anybody else want to ask any questions? Because I could sit here talking to David for hours, and that would be unfair on David and
I,
anybody else.
I like the Hood Association badge, by the way. I meant to say
Thank you. Yeah, I'm an honorary vice president of the
Good. It's good
association.
to see that it still survives.
Yes, we're doing. We've got our reunion on the 24th of May proper this year, Saturday,
Yeah, good.
which of course is the anniversary of her sinking. And I made a number of films about Hood, and they very kindly made me an honorary vice president. So
Yeah.
I shall also be providing the entertainment on my guitar, so that they know no fear, these people.
We need somebody to do an expedition on the wartime Ark Royal, like the one that found out how much Hood had been damaged.
Did they find Eagle or Royal? They did do one of them in the
Ark
Mediterranean.
Royal, but
Yeah,
the
yeah.
chap who did it has rather kept the film of it as a closed
Oh, yeah. Well, people do that. Yeah.
thing, which so I remember
Well,
David
yeah,
Brown getting very excited about
yeah.
what must have gone wrong.
I know. Yes, it
She
must
like
have.
Hood broke up into
Yeah.
lots of pieces.
Yeah, she's in a terrible state, really. She's completely inverted, which is unusual for wrecks. They usually
Mm,
reassert themselves hydrodynamically and sit up like Bismarck did.
yeah.
But she was so badly damaged. And
Mm,
indeed, one of the arguments, I'm in the second explosion camp, that because the 600-ton conning tower is something like 1.7 kilometers away from the main,
yeah.
what you can determine to be the main body of the wreck, because just after about B turret or before, it's gone. It's there, all right. We just didn't have enough time on the site to. It's a huge
Yeah.
debris field, and she's in a terrible state. It's very sad to see.
Anyway,
There we are. But
a
there we
long
are.
way from
And of course, a
there.
strong connection with Orkney. I mean, the book that I wrote with David Mearns, who found her. And of course
Yes.
features
Yes,
that,
got
that
that.
the classic painting. Yeah, of
Yeah.
it's called Farewell the Hood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh
So,
well.
there we are. Well, folks, are we? So are we there? We had what a wonderful presentation, David. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you for making all that time for us and a really interesting presentation. Um, can I ask a question wearing another hat? I'm
Hmm.
I'm the editor of the Journal of the Britannia Naval Research Association. I'm flashing a lot of books around. We do produce this very nice, high quality journal twice a year. Is
Right.
that, so forgive me, folks, for doing this bit of would-be recruiting. Is there any way you could work that into a piece for this journal? And there's no rush. It's not coming out till ages later in the year. We've just done this one.
Yeah.
If you could, I can talk to Moya about contacts for you
Yeah.
um,
If
at your own length and with your pictures, because that's the sort of thing
yes,
BNRA loves. And do join us if you feel like it. Go to Whitlock.
okay, yes.
My end of plug, folks. Sorry, that's very wrong of me, but never mind.
Okay, yeah.
Love you to do that because I think, and it's very
Yeah,
nice.
well, you
As
could
I
pass
say,
it on. Yeah, I like the
we do
idea.
a nice job on it. It's a properly produced piece, and it goes to all the members.
Super.
By the way, this was about the Holland boats. That's the Fenian Ram, and this is the capture of a Spanish ship by HMS Centurion. It's the story of one of the people who served in that
Right.
particular squadron.
Okay.
And so, if that's and we one of our contributors, Lieutenant Commander Bob Horner, who does wonderful pieces.
Right.
His last one's on the Norway campaign, 1940. It was a very, very interesting subject. Go into great detail with that. So I think we're there. I think you must be gasping for a cup of tea, David. I think you certainly deserve it.
Well,
Maybe
I'll have a glass of water instead. Yeah.
well, yes. So shall we draw matters to a close? I'm in the hands of our technical
Yeah.
supremo.
Yeah.
If he can hear me, it's many thanks from all of us, and especially thank you from another new production, and of course the whole celebrating Scapa Flow program, of which this will be a jewel in the crown. So thank you very much indeed, David. If anyone else wants to jump in, please do. I think people are being shy and retiring, but that's all right. We can allow that. So let's draw matters to a close and a round
Right.
of applause really from me. I will clap for everybody. And thank you very much for all the hard work you put in. And
Thank you.
we do that piece. I'll be in touch later. There's no mad rush and it doesn't come out until
Super. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Cue the
Right.
music, I think. Here we go.